Welcome to WinCam, everyone, and I wanted to welcome Chris Gordon, who is a Winchester resident, and I've known Chris a long time. I've distributed your CV to everybody, and I can do that again. But if you want to see it, I don't know anyone else in my. I'm not sure I know anyone who's busier than you and more accomplished as a capital program professional, Chris. It's very kind of you to make time to come tonight, and we appreciate it. Can you I thought just to break the ice, could you tell people just a little bit about your educational background and where you grew up and how'd you end up in Winchester?
And well, first of all, I've been in Winchester for 32 years, so I'm very, very happy to be here because we owe the town a lot. I mean, we raised our kids here, we live here, we've done all the sports here, so if there's anything we can do to help, we're always, we're always very glad to help. And by the way, my nose is a quick 23 stitches, no big deal. So
hate to see the other guy.
This is the other guy. So I apologize for having a bandage pre-Halloween, but it is what it is. And I've known John Miller a very long time, and you don't need me because John is one of the better, certainly one of the more knowledgeable infrastructure in the world. So John knows this very much, very well as I do. But my whole career has been spent either building things or maintaining things. Engineer undergrad, engineer graduate school. I still teach at a graduate school. I've done a lot of projects around the world. Right now, I'm the head of real estate for Wynn Resorts, and we're building in UAE. We're building in the U.S. We're trying to build in Japan. We're involved in Thailand. So I'm on an airplane all the time, somewhere in the world, trying to build something. And in prior lives, I spent 10 years at Massport at the airport here. I was a director of capital projects doing the Logan modernization program, all the post 9/11 security stuff, we did $4.5 billion worth of work when I was out there, all kinds of capital projects. I ran the real estate group for Harvard. And then in my spare time, I get involved in a lot of stuff. I'm actually on the board of a private high school up in Maine, it's a fascinating school. We have local students from 14 towns that don't have a high school. And then we have kids from 30 countries, and we mish them all together. We've got 650 kids in a school. And the reason it's relevant tonight is we spend a ton of time trying to optimize our capital budget. We have a big campus. Nobody has enough money. No school ever has enough money. So we're constantly debating how to maintain facilities, how to do all that. I'm also on the board of a big real estate company in the Middle East, where we have projects in Abu Dhabi, Egypt, Jordan, Kuwait, Libya, and a few others. So we're also doing the same thing, trying to figure out how to maintain facilities, how to maintain assets and do things that way. So long story short, I've spent all of my career trying to figure out how to either build new projects or maintain existing projects. So when John said, would I be willing to have a conversation about how the town thinks about their assets, I'd be thrilled to. So glad to be here.
Appreciate it. Just maybe half a minute about, I think you actually started Massport's capital program. Can you tell a little bit about it?
I don't know if you know the history of Massport. It's a fascinating agency that has all kinds of controversy and scandals, but at the core, it's amazing. I mean, it's just an amazing place with all sorts. We had Logan Airport, Hanscom Airfield, Worcester Airport, Tobin Bridge, Seaport. We had a lot of development property. When I got there, they had a free-for-all on how to spend money. So everybody would raise their hand and either politics or loudest voice or whatever, and we're spending little means based on that. So John and I actually involved in some work there to figure out how to prioritize the capital projects. We worked with some consultants and created a very organized way on prioritizing capital projects, and that turned into them asking me if I wanted to stick around and work, so I stayed there for 10 years. But the beginning of that part of my career was trying to figure out how to prioritize, because when you've got a runway here and a terminal there and a hotel there and a sewer line there and a security project here, and you don't have money for all of them, how do you prioritize? So we spent a lot of time coming up with a logical way.
Thanks. Because time's short, and I made a commitment to Dave Gauthier, we'd be out of here at 8. So I'm going to just jump right into the slides, and the slides are more directional. They're not intended to limit what Chris and I talk about.
Slides, or so we don't take too many notes.
No, the slides will be available. Yeah, we'll distribute them. I one of the first topics I just want to get your thoughts on is about useful life. do buildings have useful life? Do systems in buildings have useful lives? What do people need to know
I
about
should
that?
say up front, some of this may be complete review for some of you, so I apologize. I'm not sure of the level of knowledge in the field, so if I'm above or below, let me know. Yeah, everything has a useful life, right? And when you build a building, you decide, does it have a 20-year useful life, a 30-year useful life, a 40-year useful life? When you put in a system, it's going to have as much shorter life, like an HVAC system. Carpeting probably has a full 5-year useful life. Infrastructure hopefully has a much longer useful life. Roads,
You mean horizontal stuff? Yeah.
horizontal stuff. So, yes, we always try to plan ahead and decide how long something should last. And then if you're lucky and maintain it well, you can get more years out of it. But we definitely, especially doing financial analysis, you have to definitely think about a useful life. And it's always a guess, of course. But if you get the right people involved, you can usually do a pretty good guess. And when people say like a building has a 30-year useful life, it doesn't mean it's going to fall down in 30 years. That means in 30 years you have to do a major renovation. All of it. So, very seldom do we see, at least in all the civilized countries, buildings seldom fall down anymore. But they certainly get worn out and tired and inefficient, and not environmentally friendly.
When an engineer designs a building, is that a decision an engineer makes? I mean, how to design?
No, and then the code usually is so much more conservative than they're thinking. They can say they're going to do a 20-year life, but you're never going to be able to design a structure. It's going to fall down in 20 years. But with the interiors of the building and the system, it's sure. I mean, when I worked at Harvard, I ran the real estate group. Harvard, we were building a lot of the new science buildings, and the scientists would tell us, if I'm not out of business in 10 years, I fail. So you don't need to build a 30, 40-year life, because all the hoods and all the systems, all the stuff, that's all gone. That's temporary. We're not going to keep it. So in that case, we wouldn't buy inexpensive stuff, but you didn't have to gold plate it because you knew it was going to be ripped out, in 10 years. On the other hand, if you're doing a library on a campus, it's not going away in 20 years. It's going to be there for a long, long time. So you can think differently about the useful life of the equipment. So yeah, you have to make those decisions. And the easiest example that, I know I'm oversimplifying, but carpet's a great example. I could put a carpet in this room that's going to last 100 years. You'll never know the difference. It would cost you a fortune. Or I could put a regular carpet in that's going to last 3 years, 4 years. It's going to wear out. I mean, that's the easiest example of how you think about useful life.
So, what are some of the key elements in a building that systems that have different useful life? So, like roofs and electric plumbing. Are these all different variables?
Yes. I mean, those exposed to the elements like roof and paint and windows deteriorate first because they're exposed to the elements, especially in New England with the weather. Stuff inside that's behind the walls you want to last forever. So, like electrical wiring, you don't want that to wear out in 20 years. HVAC, it probably will, right? So the furnace is going to wear out. I mean, everybody knows the furnace, the hot water heater, a lot of this stuff is going to wear out, but it's pretty easy to replace. I mean, you hate to do it, but it's pretty easy to replace. If somebody said to rewire this room, you've got to gut the room. So there's a big difference in that. So most people invest properly in stuff that's sort of hard to get to, behind the walls, not going to change. And then they invest less in stuff that's easier to fix. And maybe it's going to, technology, for example, you don't want to, somebody says, I've got technology that lasts 100 years, and why on earth would you do that? It's going to be obsolete in 5, right? So you don't have to worry.
If you build the same building in the private sector, the public sector, do they wear differently?
Well, it depends, but no. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the public sector, a lot of time in the private sector, and we could go on for hours about that. But if you use the same architects, the same materials, oftentimes the same contractor, you should get the same dirt. The issue that you do see sometimes in the public sector is, depending on the state and the country, sometimes you're forced to use contractors that aren't qualified. So if you get a contractor or laborers, I mean, right now we're building the UAE, and a lot of the laborers you have to train. They don't have the same skill set that you have. Some Boston Union bricklayer is going to be a lot better trained than a woman who's not done. So labor is an issue, but other than that, you can usually get the same building.
I guess just to finish this slide, so you have different building systems inside the building. Do they wear out at the same time? Do they wear out at different times?
No, it's not like they're going to wear out at the same time. So, you can date them. You can predict when they're going to wear out. Lighting fixtures, and heating systems, and VAV boxes, all that stuff. I mean, you can do a pretty good guess of when they're going to wear out.
How predictable is that? I mean, are you off by 100%, 10%? I mean, is it?
Well, it's not an exact science. It also depends on the maintenance.
Okay.
It also depends on sort of the climate and the wear and tear. But you can be pretty accurate. I mean, if you think about it, and John knows this, but I mean, maintaining anything is sort of this, a U curve, where if you maintain it too early, you're wasting money, and if you maintain it too late, you're going to have to spend. think about painting your house, right? If you paint it when it really doesn't need to be painted, then you kind of wasted money. If you wait too many years and the boards start to rot and you have to replace all the boards, you waited too long. You got to find that sweet spot in the middle where it's about, painting your house might be every 8 years. Right? You say, about 8 years in a Winchester climate, I should repaint my house because it's going to be, a good use of money and it's not too expensive. And, people instead, they drag it out. They say, well, I get another couple of years, another couple of years. And by the time they go to paint it, they got to rip out all the, the siding's rotted, the flashing's gone, and it costs 10 times as much. So can you predict it exactly? No, of course not, but you can come pretty close. You don't want it to fail, right? You want to replace it, repair it before it fails. And you also want to replace it before it's too inefficient. I mean, heating systems are a good example. I mean, if you have a 20-year-old furnace that you haven't tuned up, you're going to burn them through gas or whatever you burn, right? If you put in a new system, you want to replace that.
Let's move on. Just a couple background thoughts. We have a report from the controller. There's about $500 million of capital assets in town. 360 million of that is in buildings. The rest of it is in flat infrastructure, vehicles, lots of stuff. And I guess one of the things that I find very difficult to explain is, and hoping you can, is, are most of your capital programs that you've worked on already baked in?
What are you baked in?
Well, we have a building, and this is going to break, this is going to break, this is going to break. Things are going to break that you own. You have a responsibility.
It's going to happen whether you plan for it.
Correct.
You can delay it, defer it, but eventually the floor needs to get replaced, the building needs to be painted. So, yeah, and it's not like you can just ignore it.
Okay. So that's... Yeah.
Yes, if that's okay.
Yep.
So let's use the solar panel for the high school as an example. When we talk about the capital investment, let's say, I don't know, like $5 million, $50 million, does that take into account, usually, industry does that take into account the future maintenance cost?
It depends let's say it's 50 million.
Yeah.
It depends what the 50 million is for. If it's just buying the solar panels, no. If it's signing a contract with the solar panel provider, it might. It just depends on the...
So if it's buying, then it's not this $50 million. Your guess is that it does not include the future maintenance cost or like periodic replacement.
I wouldn't know the answer to that, Lula. So unless you saw the document, so I don't think it's fair to ask.
No, I was just saying is that usually industry practice is it's written in the contract, or is that
usually it's not. So, for example, if you buy if you put out a bid for solar panels and somebody comes and installs and leaves, it's very unusual for them to come back.
Okay.
Maybe you sign a long-term maintenance contract with them, but unless you do that, they would come back. Now, there are some things, like right now you can outsource cooling plants and heating plants and all that kind of stuff, and then a company owns it. They'll come put a furnace in your building, and they maintain it. That's a different kind of contract. That's a lot more. That's a
Right. Thank you.
So, how do you avoid these future replacement repairs? The boiler's going to go in a building at some point. So you can sell it. You can sell the building. You don't own it. That's one way of avoiding it. You can take the building down.
Well, first of all, you maintain it as best you can to get as much. You extend that like a curtail. I mean, you can extend that by good maintenance. I mean, I've seen companies that are fascinating. They have men and women that are so good at maintaining their systems. They wash the carpet every month. They wash the walls. They take care of the furnace, and they get more mileage out of it. But eventually, you're going to get to that point. So I don't think you can avoid. Okay. Now, one thing you can do, of course, is use incredible materials. You can build out stone, or you can build. Some stuff just doesn't wear out, but you're not going to do that.
Okay. So, and we talked a little bit about the trade-offs. So you can defer maintenance and repair, but there are some trade-offs for deferred, and you've mentioned those, right?
Well, if you look at the life cycle of the building, and we talked earlier about the life cycle, but let's say it's 50 years for a building. In that, about 15% of that cost is building the building, and 85% of the cost is maintaining, which people usually don't believe. So over the life of the building, you're going to spend 85% to maintain it. That includes everything from washing it to cleaning it to replacing it to insuring it to all the stuff you do, and only 15% is building it. So if you think about it, if you build it right to begin with, and you maintain it, the goal is to cut down to 85%. That's where most of the money is spent. And people, I I've sat in a million rooms where people try to value engineer. Let's value engineer the building. Let's save a little bit of money. And 10 years later, they're shocked that it's falling apart. And I'm all for value engineering, but you get what you pay for, right?
So when you pitch to the potential investor about like the cost benefit of owning and running the building, you take into account the future maintenance cost, that 85%.
Yeah, if it's a good investor, they're going to ask all the questions.
The owner would take it in,
Right.
not the contractor.
Yeah.
Right, understood.
Yeah, and they'll make decisions on it.
Okay.
That's why you always want to have, for example, you always want the operating people involved in construction business.
Right.
You know, it's going to cost me twice as much to maintain that. And
Right.
easy examples of furnace splitter or mini split or whatever you want to use.
Yes.
So let's keep moving on. So the town, I want to give you a little background. The town is upgrading. There's a
John Chisholm. Sure. Is that what you got?
Yeah,
Is it not working?
It works, it just doesn't sound as good.
Okay. I'll get rid of it. Thank you for.
the town is upgrading what was known as the VFA database, which is Vanderwaal Facility Advisors. You probably know them.
Yep.
And the product from that effort, which FinCom has been very supportive of, but it's going to produce estimated useful life cycles for buildings with replacement costs estimated today for each building and for each of the major systems. So we're going to have a database in the next 6 to 9 months, which
That's great.
will say, the X school heating system is going to last 12 years and the replacement cost is X. And there'll be a list of near-term repair and maintenance items. Is this kind of, how would you use this kind of information? What do you use it for in a capital project?
I mean, I use this kind of stuff every day. I mean, what you want to do is set up a capital programming strategy. And I'll get into the weeds a little bit, so bear with me. But anybody who owns facilities, especially a town like Winchester, should set up what we call a capital program. And the capital program, people say, how long should it look out the window? I would say a 5-year capital program is pretty good. If you do like a 20 or 30-year capital program, it's a little bit of a waste of time because it's really, I mean, you can do the out years, but it's not accurate. If you do like a 1-year program, point, right? It's not that accurate. So I like to see like a 5-year capital program and like a 10-year look ahead is pretty helpful. In that, you want to divide it up by facilities. So you want to have schools and the fire department and town hall and roads and all the, landfill and all that stuff, not landfill, transfer station. You want to divide it in individual projects. And then within those projects, you want to divide it up by improvements and maintenance because they're very different. The reason you divide all those categories is it's very hard to decide, am I going to do a new soccer field or a new fire truck or a new classroom or a new this? And I've sat with people with their PhD for years trying to figure out how do we do that. You can't have a rational discussion about, well, do we need 2 more fire trucks or, we need to paint the school. So what you do is you put it into individual, you let all the school projects compete among the school projects and all the fire department projects among the fire department projects and all blah, 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 blah. And then you've got the best projects across all those programs and then let them compete. And then it's a much more rational decision. And then you're not stuck in a room going, well, they really want a new basketball court, but geez, I'd like to put a new roof on the cemetery building. Oh, you can't. It doesn't make it. And don't pretend you're going to set up this great criteria. So first of all, I'd set up a detailed capital program that's, 5-year window, a 5-year program, like a 10-year look ahead. So you're looking out 10 years of what you want to do. I would take all this data and I would enter it into a program like that. I also would not overcomplicate it. No offense to Winchester. I love Winchester, but it's not NASA. You don't have to know every bolt and every screw. I see towns and cities where they set these up and they're so proud they have like 700,000 activities and nobody ever looks at it again. They can't. They're overwhelmed by it. So I would keep it relatively simple. You don't need to track every windowsill and every piece of carpet. You need to track the big stuff: roofs, heating and cooling systems, alarm systems, maybe carpeting, and there's the big items you need to track. And the rest of it, I wouldn't worry about everything. So I haven't seen the Vanderwaal study, but they're pretty smart. So hopefully they make it relatively simple where you can track, for the school department, maybe you're tracking 100 items. You're not tracking 10,000 items because it does get lost and people do get overwhelmed. And if you think you're overwhelmed, try being the maintenance person that gets the report and says, here's 72,000 things you have to do in the next year. I mean, I know what they'll do with it. They'll either quit or they'll throw it away or they'll lie. And I'm just being honest with you. Instead, if you give them like 20 things and say, at the Winchester High School, here's 20 things due in the next year, perfect. They'll get 20 contractors, they'll get 20 schedules, and they can manage that no problem. So you got to keep it, relatively organized. So I would take the van der Waal study. I would set up a little bit of a structure. I wouldn't overdo it. And then I would put in a predictive maintenance process in place. So you have a list of all the roofs and a list of all the furnaces, and a list of all this. Every year you should revisit it and prioritize and make sure it's right. The school board I'm on, we do this all the time. We have a buildings and grounds committee. Very smart people, and they literally go through, roofs and windows, all sort of stuff. And then every year you put together a capital budget and turn them loose and they go do it. So it's not that hard. But if you don't do it, sorry, John, if you don't do it, first of all, the maintenance guys are lost, right? They're putting out the latest fire. Somebody calls from the high school and says, the boiler's making a clanging noise. Then somebody says, there's a leak here. And they literally are running around. I mean, I put myself through school as a maintenance guy and a construction worker. I get it. They're calling all the time, going, okay, this is broken. You run over and fix it. And you're missing the fact that there's something much more important that's about to break, behind you. So if you put them on a little bit more organized path, you can get things done better. And it's better for them, too, because they have a little more organized life.
You want to replace the boiler. You'd like to replace it the week before it breaks.
Exactly.
And not the week after. But you also don't want to replace it 5 years before it breaks, or 10 years.
That's the curve.
How? But you're also, every boiler is going to be a little bit different. Some are going to last an extra 10 years. Some aren't going to last. How do you sort of quantify that? That we want to replace this boiler, but we're going to keep an eye on it. It's my own house too. I don't want to replace it until it breaks. But I want to do it right before it breaks.
That's the magic of it. It's very hard to do that.
Yeah.
The van der Waal folks should, for example, the van der Waal, I'll use them. If they came out and looked at the boiler at the high school and said it has 8 years left, they might be off by a year or two, but it's not 20 years, right? And you always want to replace it before it breaks, and you also want to replace it before it gets too inefficient. I mean, oil's expensive, or natural gas, or even electricity. I mean, we're switching everything to electric, but it's not like that's cheap either. I mean, it's this magic of, make everything electric. And then you look at the electrical bill, you're going, oh my
Chris, don't systems like boilers send you signals though too?
Yeah, they can.
And like,
You're right.
we used to heat the building, spending 1,000 gallons a year. Now we're using 2,000 gallons. We're less efficient.
And how much are we spending on maintenance? I mean, and you'll get signals, but what you don't want to do is have a catastrophic failure where the guy says, or the woman says, I just can't fix this thing, right? So you're right. When do you pull the trigger on it? It's trickier on like a roof. I mean, you can patch a roof forever, but at some point, is it really worth it? So, but yeah, that is the tricky part. But
that's also so. Let me get back to that. So, like, how does van der Waal, when van der Waal or any engineer puts a time frame on something? No, the first guy who designed the boiler, who picked the boiler, said it was going to last 20 years. Where do you get the 20-year number?
Well, I mean, the design engineer should do it based on their experience, right? If there's somebody who's designed 1,000 of these things, I hope they keep data of how long they last, right? They should know how long the cable is going to wear out, how long all the...
And they have information from the manufacturers, correct?
Right.
So, I mean, I think in the model is that VFA engineers are similar to it. They have the same experience as designers.
Right.
I mean, that's the model.
John,
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
So the van der Waal investment that we made, we bought the software, but did we also pay for the engineers to do a one-time study, or like
They're going through the one-side study now, and that's going to produce. And I believe I'm hopeful that this may be something we get after the finance committee has to support that becomes regular. We keep that up.
Okay, and what's regular? What would you consider?
Well, for example, at Logan Airport, which is not Winchester, right? They're different. We did it every year. So we had a template. We had a template of all the facilities, and we had somebody, like, matter of fact, sometimes I think it was van der Waal, but somebody like van der Waal walked it. They took like a month every year, and they walked everything. They checked in the boilers, checked in the roof, checked in the windows, checked in blah, 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 and they would update the report. In that case, it was more urgent because it was an airport. You may be able to do it every 2 years, but I wouldn't wait like every 5 years. And you pay them to literally walk around. And once they get in the routine, it's pretty, because they'll have a template, right? They'll be on an iPad. They'll be just marking it up, and pretty straightforward. And again, back to what I said a while ago, keep it simple. They should be checking, 100 items, not 10,000 items.
So on this slide, I just want to cover the last points. We already talked about I think you call them additions or improvements.
Yeah, this is improvements and maintenance.
How do you price new commitments? I mean, so you're sitting there in a capital you're the capital program manager. Someone wants to do X. You don't have a bid for it. You don't have a...
Right. It depends on what it is. If it's pretty straightforward, there's probably somebody in the room who can do it. Like if somebody says, we have to replace the boiler at the library, and it heats, 20,000, somebody might be able to put a number on it, but usually you have to hire either a cost estimator, an engineer, or a contractor. And the best in the world at cost estimating are contractors because they live and die by it. So if you can get a contractor to work for a fee and do cost estimating, it's usually more accurate. If not, there's plenty of cost estimators. You mentioned like RS Means, which is a book. You can go online, you can type in information, and it gives you a result. It works great if you're trying to get in the ballpark, but it doesn't necessarily know the market right now and the labor rates and inflation and everything else. So, I mean, we have the best luck hiring contractors. And that doesn't mean you're giving them the work. That means you're just hiring for a fee to do cost estimates.
So there's a company, Gordian, that bought VFA and bought Means. So this one company, Gordian, owns both VFA and the Means cost data.
So they should be able to do it.
That's their business.
Yeah.
When you're pricing a new improvement, are you pricing, what do you price? The design and construction, you include long-term M&O, why?
You price the design and construction, of course, and then you price the long-term operating costs.
Why?
So because the 85%. So if you've got a building that lasts 50 years, 15% is the design and construction, the 85% is the operating cost. That means buying fuel, buying electricity, doing regular maintenance. You know, is it finicky? Is the kind of building that has to be maintained a lot? Because if you're doing a return analysis, I know you're in the public sector like down in Winchester, you're not trying to make a return, but you are trying to balance your budget. You have to compare investments. So you want to find, if you're looking at two building types, for example, on the school board I am, we recently built a big field house. It's an athletic facility, and we priced 3 or 4 different kinds of buildings, and some of them were much more expensive to maintain than others, like dramatically more expensive. That would have dwarfed the construction costs. So we spent a little bit more, not a lot, a little bit more on the construction because we knew the operating costs were going to be dramatically less. And that was mainly around the volume of the building and the insulation and the HVAC system.
When is the best time to have the operating cost discussion? Before you hire a designer? While the design is being
with
done?
The designer. With the designer. I mean, assuming the designer, and I think they are, I mean, most designers are they're unbiased, they're giving out, I mean, they can make dramatic decisions about, there's a classic curve you've probably all seen, but at the very beginning of the project, you have the biggest ability to make an impact on the cost. As you go down through design, it drops. When you get down to, and nobody likes this, but when you get down to construction, your ability to change the cost is gone.
Yeah.
They're just following the recipe, right? And the contractor says, listen, you want a steel building with a metal roof? Fine, I'll go do it. That's not going to impact your cost. Now you think about change orders and all these dirty words. Oh my God, I'm change orders. Changes are, even if you have the average in the U.S. is 7% change orders, that is just noise in the system, right? If you're lucky enough to get 7% of construction, and that's only 15% of life cycle cost, you're down to 1% of the life cycle cost. It doesn't matter. What does matter is way up front at the beginning, working with a designer and various consultants to scope the project, design the project, and come up with the right answer.
So Chris, when you have a proposal for construction, new construction, say, does that include an estimate of operating costs, or is that something you have to ask for separately?
You usually have to ask for it separately. And sometimes you don't want the architect to do it. No offense to all my friends who are architects, but they don't do the best life cycle cost analysis because that's not their thing. But you can definitely get, companies that will do it for you. And it's not crazy expensive. People think, oh my God, one more consultant, another big fee. Well, in the scale of things, it's usually worth it. Although you'd be surprised how many people ignore it. I mean, I see, I get asked to go talk to people, not like this, but because I teach a course, I oftentimes get invited to go to somewhere in the world and help some troubled projects. I'll say, well, what was your, you're building like $1 billion something. What was your life cycle analysis? We never did that. And it's half built. I'm like, ooh, okay. Happens all the time. So
I'll try to keep moving because I want to make sure we have a solid half hour.
I have plenty of time, so don't rush your bike.
Yeah. So I want to separate assembling the spend side of the capital plan from the money side, the funding side. Okay. So just this slide is just about, how do you assemble the spend side of you're sitting in Massport. You've got to deliver your 5-year capital plan. How do you assemble?
Well, it goes back to dividing it up into individual programs. So for Massport, for example, we had the aviation program, the maritime program, the real estate program, and then within the aviation program, we had terminals, we had runways, we had fire equipment, we had all these different categories, and each category had to compete among itself. That was their own little league. That was the AFL or the NFL. They had to compete in their own little league to get the best project, and those best projects then had to compete with everybody else. So at the very end, you get the fire truck versus the terminal, but not till the end. So if you keep it all organized like that, you can have a much more rational discussion. And then you work your way up through it. Eventually you come up with it. As far as the funding, I know you want to keep that separate, but some of these things get a little higher priority if they're self-funding, or if they have a grant, or if they have whatever. So when you do the prioritization, you can't ignore the funding.
I think you've already said this, but how do you prioritize between commitments already made, that, the kind of baked in stuff, your existing assets, and new improvements? How do you prioritize between them?
Well, yeah, we used to set up a formula, and we kept it simple. But you had to if somebody said, listen, we have to install 20 new roofs this year. It's going to be $10 million in roofs, but we also want to build this brand new whatever. I mean, you have to, at some point, you do have to evaluate between the two. And then what we used to do is set up a ranking system based on our mission. Like, what's the mission of the town of Winchester, right? Is it to do X, Y, or Z? And you have to set up some sort of, otherwise it's just guessing, right? You have to set up some sort of ranking formula. And you're not going to be able to not do the roofs. I mean, a lot of that stuff is, as you said, it's baked in. So it's a little hard to prioritize a new shiny thing versus a roof, because eventually you got to do the roof. It is possible to prioritize between all the new shiny things. And, a town like Winchester should do some new things, right? You built some, and we've enjoyed, I mean, my kids have loved it. You built some beautiful new schools, athletic fields, all kinds of cool stuff. You don't not want to do that, but you got to figure out how to prioritize.
Should they compete against each other, in your view? Or
yeah,
no?
Well, what we would normally do is we would set aside a certain amount of money for maintenance. I mean, most insurance companies, for example, require to set aside 2 or 3% for maintenance. So if you've got $1 billion worth of asset value, they would say every year you better spend at least 2, maybe 3% on maintenance.
2% of the
asset value.
Of the asset value.
Right. So if you got $1 billion, let's do the math. If you got $1 billion, that's like $20-30 million, right? Is that 2 or 3%? I think so. That would be your
Your baseline maintenance.
And you'll go a little above it, a little below it, but the school board on one, that's exactly what we do. We set a budget of, we have an asset value for the campus, and every year we say we've got, I think it's like $650,000 a year we spend, and you kind of got to stay within that. So the furnaces, the roofs, that stuff, and then you're not competing that against everything else. When it comes to a new shiny building, then you really got to figure out how to fund it, right?
Okay. How can you tell us about what a capital program looks like if you were looking at it on paper?
I was going to bring one with me. I still have an old Katie Adams capital program that she did at Massport. It was a person John knows. Of course now it'll all be digital, but basically it's a book divided by program. So here you might have a program for schools, you might have a program for libraries, you might have, so you got that. And then in it, you've got the usual, I mean, you all know this, but then you've got a basic budget system that has all the projects, has the funding, the total cost, then it's got it spread out over multiple years, it's got total cash flow on the bottom, and you can predict every year how much you're going to spend. And, I can show you examples of them, but they're pretty straightforward. Then you can do cash planning. You can spread them out over certain years. You can do all the financing you need to do. So it's a glorified list of projects, but it's very detailed in when the cash is going to get spent, how much is going to get spent, what there are for contingencies.
So it's sources and uses of funds?
Yep, has to be. Yep.
Why?
Because if you don't have the sources, you can't do the uses. So if you don't have the money, you can't do the project, obviously. So you have to balance, just like anything else. I mean, 101, you've got to have the sources to pay for all the projects you're doing. And it's also a dynamic document. It changes every day. Something's going to go over budget, under budget, delayed, whatever it's going to be.
Okay. Again, these are just directional, so I'm happy to keep going. So one of the things that I think that in my experience, it's almost a chicken and egg problem. You kind of know the projects you want to do, but you're not quite sure what they cost. How do you go get the money? How do you make the case for the money if you don't have?
I don't think you do.
Okay.
I think you have to do enough homework so you know generally what it costs, which means usually spending a little bit of money. So if you're going to do a new school in Winchester, you have to spend a little bit of money on an architect to figure out what it is and roughly what it's going to cost. Not exactly, but otherwise, you're not going to raise money for it. You're not going to take out debt because you don't know what it is.
So, and I think the question I wrote there is a little bit better. So if you don't know, flip that around. If you don't know what the funds are available over time, how do you assemble a capital program to spend that money?
I don't know if you can. I mean, if you have no idea how much money is going to be available, how do you put together a capital program? Unless it's pay as you go. In other words, you can put together a 10-year program, but every year you revisit it, and if you don't have the money coming in, you don't go forward, right? I mean, you can do that. but generally you should have a pretty good idea of the money coming. And also, not to get into the weeds, but you should also make sure you budget a contingency. I mean, in both a schedule and a budget contingency. As I said a while ago, the typical project in the U.S. goes 7% over budget, but that's 7% after it's designed. It's like 20% before you design it, because the twinkle in the eye is, somebody wants a new school, and all of a sudden they're like, but we really need 2 gyms. We need this, we need that. So if it's 7%, I would always budget something like 10%, and then I would do the same on the schedule. People always forget about the schedule contingency. Everything happens. I mean, construction's messy. It's hard to control.
The town's experienced that there's been quite a bit of escalation in cost
Yeah.
and time.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Did you say 70%?
7%.
7%
So
over budget.
that's from
on
when
average.
that's from after you bid it. So when you start a project, so you design it and the budget's all over the places, you will figure out the design. When you finish the design before you start construction, from that point on, in the U.S. it averages for buildings about 7% increase in cost.
Okay.
But if you go back to the beginning of design, it's a much higher percentage because, you figure everything out during the design process.
Right. That makes sense.
Can I ask a follow-up on that?
Yeah.
When you're working on building a building, you have contingency in your budget to build the building.
Yes.
So you're saying that should be at least 7%, I guess? Or what is the contingency you have when you're designing a building?
From the beginning of construction on, we usually budget roughly 10%, because 7% is the average, but
Yeah,
plenty of them go
that's right.
way over. I mean, things happen, and people want to blame the contractor, but a lot of times it's just something that happened, right? Somebody changed their mind, they found something underground, whatever. So I would usually budget roughly 10% depending on the project. Now, if it's a crazy project that nobody's ever done before, you want a higher contingency. If it's a typical risk analysis. And then it is for civil work like roads and ditches, that kind of stuff, we only budget like 4% because they're really predictable. I mean, they're just not that complicated.
So thinking back over your time in running various capital programs, how do you solve this circular chicken and egg? Unless you make a commitment to me how much money I have, it's very hard for me to tell you the projects.
Right.
And then the flip side is, well, unless you tell me the projects, it's very hard for me to tell you I'm going to give you the money.
Well,
So
I mean,
how do you work that?
I mean, I wouldn't do that. I would define the projects. That doesn't mean to design them, but define the projects, so you know what they are, seek the funding, and then try to marry the two so you have a sources and uses. If you don't have that, I would probably have a line. I would develop a capital program that says, here's everything we want to do. And then you have to go back later and put a red line on it and say, but we can only afford to do up to this line. So you're sort of doing a cap kind of mentality where you're saying, we've got 25 projects we want to do, but when the voters speak and they're only going to give you X amount of money, you've got to go back and say, okay, we can only do this much. Hopefully you've prioritized them properly, because whatever the line is where the top priorities are.
So this slide is about another competition that's at the top of the budget, and I don't think we ever talk about it. I don't think it's usually talked about. And I'm talking about the competition between operating expense and capital expense. So I did a calculation one time. I think it's like 92% of operating expenses by the town is for salaries and overhead and healthcare and related to personnel, which is, without that OpEx, the town isn't running.
Right.
So there's another competition between, operating expenses and capital expense. And,
Right.
and
Usually,
how do you work that problem?
I'm not an expert in that, but I'll tell you what I've observed doing this stuff all over the world. Usually the operating budget has to get settled first. So usually people, do we have enough teachers or too many teachers? Do we have the right fire department? Do we have the right, where's the debt service layer in? I mean, usually good or bad, but the practical side says they usually sort out the operating budget first, because that's kind of a necessity, right? Then they figure out what's left for the capital. If you do it the other way around, you figure out the capital, then you say, oh gosh, I've got to go lay off 30 teachers. Nobody wants to do that. So you got to figure out, usually the operating budget tends to go first. If you can, you do them relatively in parallel, but I always think the operating budget is a little bit ahead. Because those are not tougher decisions, but they're different decisions. As you said, they're usually personnel, and personnel changes move slowly for a good reason, right? Nobody wants to make radical changes. Everybody talks tough about, we're going to do this, do that, but at the end of the day, there's a certain demand in the school department, there's a certain demand in the fire department, the police department, and you don't want to make, radical decisions on some of that stuff.
So we worked up this little kind of kind of a description of what this looks like. So over on the right is kind of at this enterprise level, you have the operating budget for the entire enterprise. And then a piece of that is the capital budget. That's another circular exercise of which projects are in, which projects are out, how much money can, so the capital problem is not the only problem that's going on in the finance side. What are your thoughts about?
Well, I mean, you've got the diagram, right? I mean, a couple things. One, as we talked about earlier, one of the biggest mistakes I've seen is people underestimate the life cycle costs of new projects. A town builds a new high school that they really, really spent every dime on, and 5 years later, it's pretty dumpy because they just couldn't take care of it. And 10 years later, it's really dumpy because they didn't paint it, they didn't recarpet it, and that's just so sad, right? I mean, you just don't want that. And so I think one of the biggest issues when they do this kind of budgeting, they don't think of the life cycle costs. The issue you brought up a minute ago, the prioritization between operating and capital is, that is a big dilemma, but I think the operating has to go first. But the biggest message in this is you've got to do capital budget. You've got to think down the road. You got to do preventative maintenance. You got to do predictive, analysis. I mean, if you don't, you're kind of flying blind. And what if something sneaks up on you? What if God forbid, what if a roof collapses or a roadway washes out or whatever, and you haven't properly maintained it?
I recall there 25 years ago, my son was in the sixth grade. Winchester High School flooded. There were eight feet of water in the basement. The high school moved to McCall. Started at 6, and the middle school started at 2. So they doubled up in McCall for 10 months. But that was an unpredictable. Right. That's one of those events.
That may have been unpredicted, but there's a lot of stuff that could be predicted. And I'm not saying in Winchester, but around the world,
Yeah,
a lot of stuff you think in.
Massive flood.
The other dilemma you have, which is, I know we touched on it, but in Washington they call it the fire truck dilemma. I mean, you don't want to be the town manager when the fire department says, I need 3 new trucks or the world is going to end.
Right.
That's not fair, right? You got to think about what is the right number of trucks. And if you do enough analysis, number of homes, number of streets, you can usually come up with the right amount of trucks. So always fall back on analytics and data. And I'm not picking on on the fire department, but in other words, if you're looking at a town the size of Winchester, there is probably analytics that'll tell you roughly how many trucks you need.
Yeah.
So it isn't just, I need more trucks, I need more school buses, I need more football equipment, I need more basketballs. There's ways to figure that out, and you can usually find an analytic that will help you with that, as opposed to, you don't want to be at a town meeting and, you got the fire department here, the police department here, the school department, and they're all fighting over the same money. I mean, that's...
In an ideal world, would you like all the schools to get to their useful life, at end of their useful life in the same year?
No.
So
Let's
we have...
stagger the ladder.
And that's true for police cars and other...
For sure.
So you're part of... Is that part of capital programming, try to stagger?
I mean,
cash flow management.
Police cars, great example. Fire trucks, school buses. I mean, let's say you have 100 school buses. You should have, they've got a 10-year useful life. You should have 10 of them that you replace every year, and you just regularly replace them. And people say, well, what if, back to the boiler question, what if I replace it too early? You're going to get more when you trade it in. So it works out, right? I mean, you can, if you trade in 10 buses a year, you're going to get a certain amount of money for them. If you trade them in a little too early, you get a little bit more money for them. It works out. But you don't want the buses to break down and be a mess.
So let's hypothesize a town that thinks they're in a capital deficit.
Yep.
Real or imagined?
Every town is.
Real or imagined? How do you work this problem? Do you have to work it up at the upper level, at the enterprise level?
No. I think you want to start at the facilities level. The Vanderwaal study you did is a great start. So you're soon going to have an inventory of all your assets around town. That'll populate the database. Then you need to put a structure in place on how you're going to prioritize them, right? And how you're going to track them. That's the next step, is to put some sort of a structure in place. And then you're going to have rational people like you that are on the top of that pyramid trying to figure out, okay, what do I do? Because judgment always, wins in the end, and you're just going to work through it. So, I mean, I don't think this is undoable at all. I mean, people do it all the time.
Last slide. I think you kind of answered.
I like 5 years and 10 years, meaning that if you got to look down the road, I mean, I've been involved in 30-year capital programs, and it's stupid. Like, what's going to happen in 25 years? I have no idea. But in 5 years, you know what we do? We have a pretty good idea what's going to happen in the next 5 years, and we got a pretty good idea what's going to happen 5 years after that. It's just like your house, right? You can kind of say in the next 10 years, I want to do a new patio, I got to re-roof the thing, and I got to do this. If you start getting into 15, 20, 25 years, you have no idea. You're not going to live there in 15 years. So I like 5. However,
you open a new school yesterday. the roof's gonna last, according to the architect, 30 years.
You can
throw
load
that
it.
data away, or
No,
do you
no, no.
put it somewhere?
You load it into the system. For example, if you've got a 30-year roof, you definitely can load that into the system, but I wouldn't spend a lot of time on those out years. I would just load it in and have it there, and you'll catch up with it over time. But I would spend most of the energy on the next 5 years and then the 5 years after that. When I say a look ahead, so let me say the first 5 years is real projects with real budgets and real names and real everything. The next 5 years is pretty good, right? It's a sketch, but it's pretty good. After that, all the way up to the 30-year roof, you can put it in the system, but I wouldn't agonize over it.
So 1 year from now, year 6 becomes year 5.
Yep.
2 years from now, year 7 becomes year 5.
Rolling capital program.
And you're regurgitating, you're going through this analysis each year?
Yep. And you look at it every year. And after you do it for a few years, it gets pretty easy. I mean, you have a Vanderwild come in every year or two and do a new inspection. You have somebody on the city staff that updates the database. You all look at it every year and say, looks pretty
Well,
good.
there's a capital planning committee that the vice chair is in the room.
Yeah. I mean, it becomes
That's-
pretty,
They do.
the first couple of years is like, oh my gosh, this is a lot of work. But by the second or third year, it's like, kind of makes sense, right?
How have the capital programs plans that you manage differed? Massport versus Harvard versus,
Yeah.
I
mean,
are they basically the same, or are they?
the basic DNA is always the same. It's always these same dilemmas: operating versus capital. How many years do you look out? It's a lot of the very same stuff. I would say what's different is at Massport we had to be very rigorous about it because we were a self-supporting agency and we could run out of money. At Harvard, there was ability to raise money, so you had another revenue source. If you want to do a beautiful new building, you have the money, you could go out and raise the money. So there's all new revenue sources that would just show up. So it's not that they weren't rigorous, but you didn't have to worry about it. In a place like Massport, we had to budget precisely because we would literally run out of money. And I work for a private company now. We're a big company, but we do the same thing. I mean, we're very deliberate about annual capital budgets. We do exactly this. We have 6 big, huge hotels around the world that we've got, 30,000 employees around the world, and we budget everything down to the penny. We have to, because otherwise, there's no other way. We don't have any other money. If you don't make it, if the revenue side doesn't come in, you can't raise money, or you can issue debt. But in other words, there's a finite amount of money.
How much do you use your own data in these capital programs
All the time.
to populate the future?
All the time, as long as we don't overcomplicate it. Like sometimes you'll hire an analyst who will think that it's really important to track every spoon in the cafeteria. It's a waste of time. So you have to draw that line across the data and say everything below that I just don't care. I mean, you all know this. We have so much technology in this world, you can track anything, but we really try to not get bogged down in that. But everything above a certain line, yeah, we use our own data all the time. I mean, we do relampings all the time. We do filter change. For example, this is a different issue, but in our hotels, remember last year, the people that make plastic straws were suddenly the villains and plastic straws are going to end the world. So we put out an email to all our operating people and said, how many plastic straws do we use a year? I'm thinking, hundreds, 20 million plastic straws a year. I was shocked. So the reason I mention that is we then started thinking, how many air filters do we use and how many, and you start counting the stuff up. I mean, it matters. So we track, not that we didn't before that, but we track everything, kitchen equipment and, air filters and carpet tiles and cameras and everything. I mean, our resort here in Boston, we have 5,000 cameras in it. And the minute we installed them, the technology was old. It was out of date, right? So then you're constantly thinking, okay, how many cameras to replace? What happens to the back of house? What happens to all the wiring? I mean, like these cameras, I mean, they're out of date before you put them up. So there's a lot of tracking that we do.
Last question. Does this have to be complex? Or next to last question, I got one more after this.
I would hope it's not complex. And not that I'm lazy, but it doesn't get done. I mean, at the end of the line, there's a maintenance person who you're all in these meetings going, let's do this and this and this, and then you go home, right? You're done. And this person's like, shit. So if you make it over complex, it literally doesn't get done. If you make it reasonable, I mean, I don't know the facilities team here, but I'm sure they're competent, smart, but you can't overwhelm them with just massive amounts of data so you feel good and they're unable to do the job. So yeah, I think there has to be a level of complexity that it's useful, of course. But if it's overly complex, it's not going to work.
And the flip side of that, can you not do it?
I don't think so. Why would you not do it?
I mean, in other words, can you not have the capital plan?
No,
What's the...
I think then you just got your fingers crossed. And if I was your insurance company or your bank or whoever you borrow money from, I would be pretty worried because they would ask you, when is your next big slug of money for whatever? And you say, I have no idea. But when somebody calls me, I'll run out and fix what's broken. I mean, It's not going to work, right? It work well at all. And you've also got, life safety systems. You've got, fire, police, water supply for fire protection. I mean, you can't mess with these things, right? I mean, if you had no idea about your water system or no idea about your fire department,
No, I'm not, no one's suggesting.
you know what I mean? It's
No,
not, it's
yeah,
not responsible.
Yeah, it's okay. Okay. So we've run through kind of directionally what I wanted to run through, and we have a lot. I wanted to have time for people to ask Chris any question you want.
All right. I have a first. Okay. Thank you. I'm interested in the best practice in the industry or, in the engineering field in general. My question is about prioritization. So you probably talk to committees of more towns than I have ever been. So I wonder when they prioritize their programs, when they assign or appropriate their budget, do they do, I want to this year, I want 70% to cover operating and I want 30% to cover capital. So let those two categories compete among themselves and then we pick them. Or do they say, okay, we're going to be fiscally conservative. We want to make sure that our operating budget is set. So we're going to set this budget more or less done. Then we'll talk about what additional capital we would invest in.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different issues there. As I said earlier, I do think the operating budget is usually a little bit ahead of the capital budget because it's a lot of stuff you can't cut. You kind of got to know where that is. Within the capital budget, I think usually maintenance ends up being a bit of a fixed object, meaning that whether it's 2% or 3% or $1 million a year, usually people say, because you can spend as much money on maintenance as you want. Somebody can always think up something else they want. Well, I want this room repainted. I want it. There's literally an endless, infinite amount of maintenance. So you kind of have to set a limit on it and say, we're going to spend $1 million a year.
Yeah.
That's just what we're going to do. And then once that's set, the operating budget's set, then you can figure out what's our ability to finance everything in the middle. And that's the new schools, the new fire department, the new fire trucks. That's all the new stuff. And that's where that's probably the hardest. And you also have to come up with a prioritization formula. And everybody has their own prioritization formula. Everybody wants to put safety first. Okay, great. But not everything's a safety priority. But once you get past that, it's, how do you prioritize?
I'm still interested in the best of practice. Do other towns that I don't know, do they, either the town manager, select board, or the mayor has a kind of a mission statement or a criteria where it says, I care about school construction this year, or I care about the operating, the personnel salary growth this year.
Usually yes and no. Usually they all have mission statements. Usually they're all identical. So I should get past those. What you want to get down to is a strategy.
Right.
Like,
That's
do they
what I
want to
meant.
focus more on schools, or do they want to focus more on public safety or the environment, or, or aviation, or, museums, or, so usually, and I don't mean to be critical and wise a guy, but mission statements are all for,
Yes.
We save the world and do it quickly and all that kind of stuff. But you get below that and you get down to, pick your favorite town. I mean, Winchester's lucky, right? We're good at a lot of things. It's a wonderful town. I've been here for 32 years and I couldn't be happier. But there are a lot of towns in Massachusetts that are not doing so well. They say, we got to focus on housing. Like, we need more housing, or we need better athletic facilities. That's what they use for prioritization. And then they'll say, if their strategy says, and I'll make this up, we really want to focus on athletics because it's great for the kids. It keeps them out of trouble. They might make a ranking for them that frankly prioritizes athletics over everything else. They build a new turf field. They put up lights, and they maybe don't spend money on the library in the meeting that year. That's fine.
This is usually come up by the town manager, on the town manager level, right?
I don't know if a town manager can unilaterally do that, right? It's usually a strategic plan is usually done by a broader committee.
That makes sense.
I mean, I'm just guessing, but I doubt a town's going to let a town manager set all the priorities.
Right.
So, separate question for you. Yeah. You spoke about the VFA database, and is that something that requires a certain level of expertise to maintain and enter, or
Medium.
do you just get a list and anyone with a data science background or
No, you
data entry background can?
First of all, it's not that difficult, so you don't need an expert, but you do need somebody. I would suggest usually somebody who knows how to do it. And that's either in-house, like a town planner, town engineer, head of facilities, or it's a consultant you hire for 10 hours a week and they come in and do it. I wouldn't do it if you had absolutely no idea how to do it. It's going to be harder because somebody says, I want to replace the whatever, and you don't even know what the thing is, right? You get asked 10 questions every day. But it's not, most of the good facilities management systems, they're not that hard. They're not unfriendly. I mean, most of them are, they're pretty.
But I think the people doing those entries are engineers. they're civil engineers or mechanical engineers. So the way BFA is structured, they have a team of people that come in and say, I mean, they walk into a boiler and they know about, the person evaluating that knows about boilers. So it's a team. It's a
But maintaining it over time.
yeah,
be the
but
same.
but so the person entering when is this thing likely to get to its useful life? That's a different person than
Yeah, it is.
it's probably
But John's right. The expert is creating the data that populates the system, but the system, the day-to-day stuff like printing out work orders and budgets and working inside the system, I think the city staff can usually do that. But the expertise behind it is going to be the engineer. And so
Can I ask a question along those lines? So just again, like what exactly have we actually committed to? So it sounds like we've bought the software. Awesome. We've committed to getting the one-time study done.
yeah. We've always had the license. They continued the license, but I believe they used ARPA money to fund a complete redo, or re-entry, and update of the entire database.
Okay, so that's as far as we've gone, and then they haven't thought through like, okay, what does that mean? And who's going to maintain it? Who's going to?
I think there's an agreement. I think there's agreement. My understanding is between people in capital and the town that this will be an ongoing effort. This is not going to stop.
Okay.
How periodic it has to be, I don't know that that's been decided.
and I don't know how much you're spending,
it's way-
but historically, if you do it right, it's not a waste of money. A lot of towns and cities and universities and hospitals say, oh my gosh, I hate spending money on capital planning. If they do it right, it's going to pay for itself so quickly. I mean, it's common sense, right? But if not, you got to make premature replacements, or you got to wait the thing break. And
I think Enzo, the kind of same point. Turn it around. If someone running the facilities for, say, in schools, has a target out that the boilers the various heating units are going to expire in this school 5 years from now, in that school 10 years from now, 8 years, 6 years, 3 years, 1 year, then people start managing to meet. They can manage the maintenance effort to meet the expectation of when the useful life ends. So that because in the expectation that someone upstairs is saying, okay, 1 year from now, we're going to get that thing replaced. And 5 years from now, that thing's going to be replaced. You know what I mean?
No, totally. I mean,
So you're able to manage to the plan.
I totally agree. I mean, I think we talked about a couple of town meetings ago. The capital planning committee came up and said, hey, the right now we're like the Titanic, right, where we have, we're headed for, I don't know exactly how they put it, but that there was this massive problem from a capital perspective, and everyone was concerned and got everyone's attention, but then we never kind of walking out of that meeting defined the iceberg, right? Like what exactly is it? How big is it? Where is it? And I think this is hopefully going to start answering that question.
I'm very hopeful that it's a huge piece of work. But I think that I guess this is what I wasn't very successful at teasing this out of Chris, but once you have a stack of projects that you think are going to happen over the next 5 years, pretty damn sure over the next that succeeding 5 years, probably, and then you got a bunch of things over the next 10 years that we don't have to worry about those, but we know they're coming. Then that starts to put a dollar figure on what we're talking about, and then that should give people in the decision. People have to start making decisions on funding, right? I mean, it's just unavoidable. Yes.
Can I ask a naive question, a slightly different topic? You said you should expect to spend about 2% of asset value on maintenance. How do you define maintenance? Like, is a new boiler maintenance?
there's actually definitions you can use in the industry. What did you say your asset value was? I forget, like 600 million, 700 million?
360 for the buildings. That's book value. Books now.
What's 2% of that, John?
720 grand.
So, I mean, that sounds low, is that right?
7.2 million.
7 million.
So
7
if
million.
the rule of thumb works, you'd spend $7 million a year on maintenance. There is definitions in the industry of what maintenance is. And I don't have them off the top of my head, but it's like, maintaining boilers, replacing carpet. There's maintenance items and capital items. So, for example, in a room like this, if you replace the carpet, that's really going to be a maintenance item. If you rip the room to the studs and rebuilt it all, that's going to be a capital item. So there's ways you can define sort of which is which. And I mean, again, I don't have all the definitions on the top of my head, but they're...
No, I was just trying to understand whether the new boiler on the building side, it sort of is maintenance on the building, but I didn't know whether you were calling it maintenance or you're more
I
like
think everybody ought to be.
it is. Well, that's what I was assuming. It wasn't.
Replacement.
I was what I was assuming.
Probably
But a new
capital.
roof, but a roof repair might be maintenance, but a roof replacement would be a capital.
Right. And the Vanderwaals of the world can give you the most latest update on sort of what the fault. And I don't mean to be vague, but I don't remember things
no.
like. But there's ways to categorize that.
Yeah, fair.
And the 2 to 3% is based on those definitions. And 2 to 3%, there's nothing magical about it, but that's what a lot of, for example, when a lot of the groups I'm involved in, the insurance company makes you spend that much. And you might say, why would an insurance company make you spend that much? Because they don't want to insure some dumpy, dilapidated building that's a fire hazardous. I mean, God forbid, but you don't want that.
They don't want to insure a building where the fire sprinkler system fails.
Right. So they'll do their annual inspections. They'll say, what'd you do for maintenance this year? And you have to show me maintenance records. And they say, you're fine. I'll come back next year. But if they're looking around going, this thing is, I mean, I've been involved in buildings with insurance companies walked away and said, we're not insuring this thing.
But we don't have that. The public, the government doesn't. I mean, I don't know that insurance will walk away from us, but we might.
Depends. I mean, I don't think it would happen in Winchester. But there are towns around New England where some of their schools and some of their buildings are almost insurable. It's amazing. It's amazing. You see this.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Another question on negotiation, because you have a civil engineer background, and I'm sure you've been in leading negotiations on complex projects, and you, having worked in public and the private sector, you've been sitting on both sides of the table. I'm wondering, because we had this project, this Waterfield project, that would be building an apartment building right next to the train station. Yep. How is it decided that, how do they come to agreement about like a reduced number of a parking space, reduce the public access, and the enhanced or the greater burden on the plumbing system? Like how?
I don't know enough about that.
Not that
I
particular
promise.
project. I'm
I
trying
promised Chris I wouldn't put him in the middle of.
No. I wasn't
Some
asking-
projects that we're
Sorry, this wasn't an ethical question. This was a question about like the industry practice, as in how do like a public owner and a private sector developer decide on how do
Do
you
get
decide?
involved in a lot of those. I mean, the hardest thing right now in the U.S. is getting a fund to build anything, right? Because it's a very green country, which I'm totally supportive of.
Uh-huh.
But it's very hard to get a permit right now.
Right.
It's a negotiation.
Right.
Like, what is the right number of parking spaces? Because we're trying to encourage mass transit, but we're trying to minimize driving. What's the right number of EV charges? What's the right age? So the biggest negotiations that we get involved in is the regulatory side. I mean, the building itself, the building permit is kind of governed, right? And the price is a market-driven price, and the contractor's a licensed contractor.
Right.
So even though there's a squabble over little
Yeah.
stuff, that stuff kind of takes care of itself. The biggest negotiation is between somebody trying to build something, whether it be public or private sector, and those that regulate them. And I'm not criticizing either side, but that's pretty tough right now. I mean, we've got Friday. I mean, we're in the paper every day. We got projects now where it's just hard, right? Where in some countries, we do a lot of work in other countries, it's unbelievably quick.
Oh, so in other words, I'm just asking about pricing, not this particular project. It's not if it's a public owner, say a town or a bigger mass port, it's not their foremost concern that we're going to maintain this this little bucket of public goods after you install or develop this project. It's only these issues at risk are only a small part of the entire negotiation, whatever is on the plate. All the.
I'm not sure that's. I don't understand that question, Luna. I think that assumes that, like, for our purposes, we hire contractors to build things. Most of them go away, and then we own them and we take care of them. The town takes care of them. In his business, he's building for his own account. These companies are building for their own account. So they're building whatever they're building, but they're in for the entire. They're in for the entire.
You're talking about the town capital project. I was talking about the private development.
Yeah, and again, the private sector, the hardest part now is getting started.
Yeah. Okay. That's sort of as in. Thank you.
So I have a question. I'm new to all this, trying to understand. So you talk about 85% in terms of operating costs, right? And then you talk about the 2% in terms of the yearly maintenance. Are those the same? So if I divide them, they come out about 28 years.
Yeah.
Okay, so,
So let's say it's a 30-year building, the math's about right.
okay,
So the 85% should be 2% of the asset value. The asset value is going to go up over time with inflation, so we could make it very complicated, but you're right. They're roughly the same.
so that's the same thing. Because I hear operating, I'm thinking it's just to keep the building going, but it's actually to maintain it.
So if you take Chris's estimate, say it's he said 2 to 3%,
Yeah.
2% is 7.2 million. Let's say a hypothetical town is dramatically underfunding maintenance on an annual basis, year after year after year after year. What is the how does that end, Chris?
Doesn't end well. I mean, you all know. I'm not telling you who know because you go through this with your own house, and your own car, and everything. But I mean, if you underfund maintenance, two bad things happen. First of all, you have dumping facilities for a long time. Number two is when it comes time to fix them, it's dramatically more expensive. That's the U shape I talked about. You want to maintain them right at that sweet spot because if you wait too long, it's more than just fixing the carpet. I mean, if you let the carpet go too long, then you've ruined everything underneath it. Maybe the floor is ruined. It's just not working out very well. So the two things that happen is one, you just don't want to have, a school is a good example. You have a really, unattractive, unhealthy, bad air quality kind of school. Number two is when it comes time to actually do the school, and we see this in a lot of places, it costs a lot more money. It's not just a fixer-upper. It's like a gut renovation, which is pretty expensive.
And I have a follow-up question to that question. Has anyone done any work to say that it's the cost benefit, right? So if you don't do the 2 to 3% every year, it's going to be like.
There's a lot of studies on that.
So what is
as John knows,
is it 10% then?
He and I are both civil engineers. The best example is pavement, right? I mean, you understand this. Pavement in New England with the typical climate and snow plowing, you might get 10 years out of the road, right? So if you pave it at the 8th or 9th year, you're probably in pretty good shape. If you wait 25 years, two things are going to happen. First of all, it's going to be terrible for the last 15, 20 years. Number two is when you go to pave it, it's not just the pavement. Now it's the sub-base, it's the drainage, it's the utilities, it's the catch basins. So instead of spending $1 million on Swan Street, you're spending $10 million on Swan Street. You can do a cost benefit on that pretty quickly. Yeah. On the other hand, as we said earlier, with the boiler, if you maintain it too early, you just do an overlay on a pretty nice road because you got PPP money because of COVID. That's a waste of money, right? I mean, it's like great. I can go pave it. I'm gonna put some pavement down. That's not a good idea either. So it's finding that sweet spot where it's about right. And the Vanderwiles of the world, they know kind of where that sweet spot is. I mean, they'll say, okay, in about 2 more years, you ought to fix that roof because after that, it's going to really get bad.
There's a very famous pavement study by the Corps of Engineers from the 70s, which it's very famous. They looked at 10,000 miles of pavement, and it's like, you wait till the 7th year and you fix it. You should fix it then. If you wait 3 more years, your cost trip.
But it's really tempting to wait.
It's tempting, or you can't find the money, or you're buying up hula hoop instead. But that is an expensive delay.
This is tires on your car, right? I can get another 20 miles. I can get another 10,000 miles. And then you sit on the highway in the middle of the night with a flat tire, like, So, I mean, it's the same.
Other questions?
I got one more. Sure. You use a lot of contractors, I'm sure, to build stuff, right? So how do you decide whether you should use a contractor that knows you, that you already kind of know the price versus bidding something out?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. We could talk outside. I mean, first of all, our particular company builds all over the world, so I don't always have a contractor right now. Like, we're starting up in some countries now that I've never been to, so all of a sudden I'm like, okay, so you have to really do your due diligence to find the right contractor. But let's assume it's in a place we know, like Boston. We say, okay, we can go hire X, Y, Z and know them, or we can bid it. I teach a whole course on this, so I could go on for a long time. But if it's going to be an actual bidding situation where it's a lump sum contract, I would almost always compete it. Because, I mean, how are you going to know the market price if you don't? If it's going to be something like a construction manager at risk where you're just paying a fee and you're bidding on all the sub work, then you can pick a contract. We just started we're about to start about a $500 million expansion here in Boston. Suffolk Construction is going to be our contractor, who's the biggest contractor in New England. We hired them as a construction manager for a fee, but all the subcontract work gets bid out. So we get to hire them early, and they're doing all the, pre-construction work and all this work. But when it comes time to bid it out, we still get market competition for all the subs. So you can get your cake and eat it too if you do it that way. But if it's purely a lump sum bid, I have a pretty hard time just handing it to a contractor because I have no idea what the market price is. And if you're a town like Winchester, you can't do that anyway. So, I mean, it's hard to do.
Yeah, what I didn't mention, one of the things that Chris, it's in this resume, but Governor Romney made him the was the co-chair of the commission that revised the state dairy laws. So he's been swimming in that stuff for a long time. And
One of my coaches-
added the CM.
My co-chair was Marty Walsh, who went on to be the Secretary of Labor, and the other one was who I won't neighbor went to prison. So various various results. But I mean, hiring contractors is a whole long discussion we can talk about. But I mean, I one who thinks contractors generally mean well, do well, they're honest. There's this whole reputation that contractors are all crooks. That's absurd. I mean, most of them are good, but they have a lot of risk. I mean, you hire them and say, give me a lump sum to build a new high school. Oh, I mean, so there's all sorts of issues about how to hire them, how to do the risk analysis. And, but I will say, we're right now, as I said, we're building a huge project in the UAE. We're building in China. We're trying to build in Thailand. We're trying to build in Japan. We spend a huge amount of time trying to find the right contractor because you're stuck with them for a long time. And if they're going to sue you, if they're going to walk off the job, it's a disaster. So we pay a little extra to get a honest, solid, smart, credible contractor. And to bring that down to the scale of Winchester, I mean, yes, you can bid it, but you want to shortlist a list of contractors. You don't want to, you don't want somebody you just don't want to deal with. And I think most contractors are great, but there's certainly some you don't want to.
And I think just to emphasize what Chris said earlier, it's 15% of the life cycle. So, like, if you could save, 2% out of your construction costs by taking a crappy contractor, it's 2% of 15% of what you will spend on that building. So
then take that even.
It's all not worth chasing.
Take that even further, because John's exactly right. And I teach a whole lecture on this too. Take the design fees. Let's say all the design fees, civil, architecture, all of them are going to cost you 10%. That's 10% of 15%, right? So down to 1.5% of the project. And who's going to have the biggest impact to life cycle cost to build? The architect. So I sit in meetings and people are just knuckling the architect, try to get 2% more out of it. They torture you. And then they get the dumbest architect or engineer, and then the building doesn't work that well. Like, really? Okay, get that. So, I mean, I'm not trying to give away money because, trust me, I'm as thrifty as the next person, but spending a little bit of money to get a qualified designer who's going to figure out the life cycle cost of the building is going to save you so much money. So getting another 0.5% out of the architect, it's not always worth it.
Just one more point. I think Chris will be on this too. Is the new design systems that architects use? They don't use CAD anymore. They're dropping assemblies onto plans, and some of the products from these designs are, your rooftop units are this brand. They're coming. This is the source. This is what they cost. This is the expected life of those rooftop units. So like a lot of the electronic version of the building should be starting to feed into the capital programs. So like this thing it's going to happen. It's just
BIM is the best thing to happen in the industry in a long time. I mean, BIM is building information management systems where you design the building in 3 dimensions and you do all the test fits and everything at a time. The first 10 years of BIM was awful, but it's got to a point now where you can design the building on a screen to the point of everything fits. Like our change order rate has dropped dramatically since we started using BIM. Like everything works. Like all the subcontractors, all the vendors, all the manufacturers are using the same computer system. So suppliers all over the world are designing that light, and when it shows up, it fits perfectly. Like there's not and it's unbelievable. And the subs have adopted it to the point where, like the woodworking, men and women that do the woodworking, they'll do the cabinetry. Nothing is wrong anymore, and everything shows up. It all works. So the waste, the waste of material, the change order rate, the plumbing, which we're building.
Fantastic.
Yes.
That brought up a question. So what I heard you say is that typically that funding is crucial. So really you should walk in knowing what your funding is before you even step into design, because it tells you what all these little quality that you are able to use.
Right. So remember the curve I talked about? You start here, you can have the biggest impact on the cost. I mean, I'm not allowed to walk into our board unless I have somebody I'm going to pay for something, right? So if I go in and say, I need $1 billion to do this in China, they're like, well, how are you going to get the money? So, I mean, that's the sort of discipline we live in. But they also know when I tell them something's going to cost X at the beginning, they know full well that I really don't know what it's going to cost. I have a really good guess. But a year later, I can tell them exactly what it's going to cost. And they're smart enough to know that. So, like, if you're going to do a new school and the principal comes in and says, okay, it's a $20 million school, we haven't done any design yet, It's not a $20 million school, but at least it's in the ballpark. When you're done, it's going to be 18 to 26, whatever it's going to be. But yeah, I mean, every step of the way, I think you got to make sure you know how to pay.
You just to emphasize that. So you're trying to figure out what a school is. You could use, how might you do that?
The means guy.
Is the means guy?
I mean, you have to ballpark.
The square footage on what the last school cost us per square foot, with the CPI added, or what did the school at Burlington build cost on a square foot? There's ways of.
There's metrics available. I mean, if you told me you wanted to do a 1 million square foot new high school in Winchester, Massachusetts, there's a lot of people in the state that could come pretty close to what that's going to cost. Now, they're not going to be exactly right, but they're going to, they can figure it out. They know, cost per square foot, it's going to be $750 a square foot. We're going to add 3% for inflation, blah, 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 blah. They can do that in an hour, right? Now, it'll be a couple of years before we have an exact cost estimate, but at least you're not, a little bit crazy.
Other questions?
I apologize. I have to run. I have a toddler at
Capital
home.
budgeting fascinating.
No, my husband would love this lecture. He's out in here. But thank you so much.
So, well, I'm gonna. Are there any other questions? I'm gonna convene, okay, just for a second. So I'm gonna just declare that we're opened at 7:50, and then I'm gonna look for a motion to adjourn. Wow. Any other questions?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Thanks.
Thank you all for your time,
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Chris.
for your service
Yes.
to Winchester. We love
Thank you so much.